host, Zol. And as you can tell, we are leading things off a little bit differently with this week's episode. And Wrestling with Recovery is not another wrestling podcast. No, seriously, we rarely talk wrestling, if ever, on here. But this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal medical advice. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. This podcast is not intended to replace professional medical or legal advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or of management. If you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts or a crisis, please reach out immediately to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255 or text HOME, HOME, to the crisis text line at 741741. These services are free and confidential. Also visit the link in the comments. Shout out to my man Ben Jones from Australia, tuning in each week. Actually, right as soon as this thing launched, he said, "Hey, what about us across the pond, across the ocean, international viewers?" Which I then replied to saying, "Well, if it's on the internet, technically, aren't we all international?" But seriously, put a link in the comments that has the non-US based contact information. So whether for yourself or a loved one, you can always find it there. Now, as I led off with, this is, as you can tell by the open, not a typical week here for the program. One, it is Memorial Day weekend. In fact, as I'm recording this, this is Memorial Day. When this drops, it will be on Memorial Day. So I have some work obligations I got to take care of. So there won't be a new episode next week. So a chance for you to check out the archives at Wrestling with Recovery Pod. Yep, you can check that out. We got our own website, social. Give us a like, follow, comment, share. All of that would greatly appreciate it. But I was talking to my friend Christy, who is a big fan of the Friends TV show. And I was telling her about my week, and she said, "Hey, are you going to mention anything about Matthew Perry?" And honestly, at the time, I hadn't really thought about it. I just kind of, put it in the back of my mind because it is a very tragic, sad story if you're familiar with it. But then I realized, you know what? This podcast actually could probably do some good here. And so that is why today's episode is titled Matthew Perry, The Big Terrible Thing, and Ketamine. Whenever I put this episode together, I wanted to do it in an honorable way. I didn't want to do it in like a clickbaity way to try to be like, "Oh, I'm going to play to the algorithm. I'm going to use headlines." And also, I really wanted to put over Matthew Perry's book, which is amazing. His autobiography is titled Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. In a work of irony, my children's mother is a fan of the TV series. And so, as a Christmas gift, the kiddos got it for her. And whenever I got out of rehab, she was like, "You need to read this." And I did. And I'm someone that I normally don't read books. I'll listen. I do Audible, audiobooks, all of that. And by the way, I do have to say this, I think, so I don't get flagged. I'm not receiving any promotional credits or anything like that by plugging any services or books used. So this is all coming from the heart. But his autobiography, whenever I read it, I couldn't put it down. It was a book that I started reading and I just got more and more into it as someone who is in recovery. Recovery from alcohol, recovery from addiction. Again, if you want to know what I use as the term of as addiction, go back and listen in the archives there on the YouTube series, Spotify, wherever you're listening here. Because I use a different working term from Dr. Gabor Mate that fits more with what I'm hoping to accomplish with this podcast series. But I found his book, Matthew Perry's book, very relatable. And I really thought that he was vulnerable. I felt like he was honest with his struggle of staying abstinent clean and in recovery. I thought he brought his own little brand of wit and humor. And I'll say that this book isn't just for fans of Perry or for people in active addiction or recovery, but I highly suggest it for those that want a point of view to understand the why when it comes to addiction, the why in terms of relapses, the why in terms of what makes recovery so difficult to stick. Um, I thought one of the great things that he laid out in his book was the mental roadmap that an active addiction user goes through in rationalizing, justifying, minimizing, as we talked about. It's amazing someone of his stature in terms of Hollywood. You think back to the late 90s and how big that run for Friends was, not just on TV, but as a pop culture phenomenon. And here's someone who literally had every resource available to him, and he still struggled. And what I found really relatable, and you can tell as the book goes on, that as he started to work more of those roots, those core issues, the relapses became fewer and far between. Not that they didn't happen, but they were further out. Um, and so while 12 step groups, AA, NA, SA, GA, all of them talk about experience, strength, and hope, I found a lot of it in that book and highly, highly recommend it. Um, if you're just curious about the mind of the addiction, if you want to know, truly want to get under, it is kind of creepy how that book came out, and then less than, I think, was it less than a year, maybe 2 years, he ends up passing away due to addiction. It's yeah, it's worth the investment. It's worth the read. So I can't put it over enough. Um, he discusses in the book multiple trips to rehab, the 12-step groups, different treatments that he was trying. And again, I find that all very ironic because I think as an addict, we all come up with excuses why we're not going to get into rehab, why we're not going to get into treatment. Oh, we don't have enough time. Oh, we don't have enough money. Oh, it's just, and here he had all of that at his disposal and still struggled. Um, and again, it's what makes this so insidious and so difficult. And one of the things mentioned, and ultimately uh, was the cause of his death, is what you heard: ketamine, Ketamine. Um, and my biggest fear at first was fentanyl. Maybe there was something laced with fentanyl, maybe relapse with fentanyl. But ketamine, and I thought, oh, okay, well, it's a strange name, never heard it. But whenever I started doing digging, I wanted to do, I guess, as someone in recovery, I wanted to do his memory a service, an honor, by really looking at and talking about ketamine because it is so new. In fact, when we look at the research is barely a couple of decades old. I mean, this is fresh, new, groundbreaking research when we're looking at this. And ketamine is used here really within the last 10 years as a new treatment option for addiction and substance use disorder. Um, Now, yes, don't worry. We are going to discuss the different addiction treatment options like 12 step groups, including AA, NA, SA, GA, and what have you. We'll discuss the Sinclair method. We'll discuss harm reduction method. You know, we'll give all those their due time. But because of the topical nature of ketamine, and perhaps people curious as to what exactly it is, I wanted to discuss it here on the program. Now, ketamine itself, according to the Department of Justice Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, ketamine is a dissociative anesthesic that has one hallucinogenic effects. It distorts perceptions of sight and sound and makes the user feel disconnected and not in control. It is injectable, short acting anesthetic for use in humans and animals, ketamine has the potential for abuse, hence why it is typically administered under strict medical supervision. So you hear that and you think, okay, well, if it's addicting, why would you want to use it? And that's actually a really good question. I think that's something that, as we look back on, probably sit back and really have to question its effectiveness. And also, one of my biggest issues with non 12 step groups, because addiction, and this is why I love Dr. Gabor Mate's definition of addiction, because it is a complex behavior process in which relieves short-term discomfort despite the long-term harmful effects, and is a behavior that is difficult to give up regardless. um, and with all that being said, if you if you're switching one addiction for another, so I think it's important, or let me finish this. If you're switching one addiction for another, you're just caught in a vicious cycle. You're just changing out one behavior or thing for another. Simply just abstaining only works for so long, majority of the time speaking. Now, some people, they can just stop using and they're good. Um, for me as an addict, I say I'm an addict because I didn't just abuse alcohol. I abused food. I abused attention. I abused finances. There's a long list of it. But notice that probably only alcohol, drugs really gets the harsh criticism for. Um, and so as I was learning about ketamine, this is what I was really struggling with, because it's like, why would you use switch out one substance that is addictive for another? Um, Now, it was used, ketamine, that is, pronouns, pal. Ketamine was used in a research trial between January 1997. So I find that ironic because that's about the time Friends took off, if I remember correctly. It's pretty close to around that time frame. And January of 2018. So close to about 21 years of research. 7 studies were conducted during this time, 2 for cocaine use, 2 for alcohol use disorder, and 3 for opiate use disorder. The trials for cocaine and alcohol use showed promise in being effective against use, citing improvements in cravings, motivation, and use rates. So, and the way that, as I understand it, ketamine is essentially a inhibitor. Um, Hence why there is that dissociative feeling. Ketamine is used in surgical procedures. It is very easy to maneuver around. In fact, in emergencies, like if you were to go on a skiing trip and say, break your leg really badly, they would. It's not uncommon for emergency personnel to use ketamine to inject that to essentially numb the pain and help the person calm. One of the side effects of ketamine is increased blood pressure. So, whenever you think of Matthew Perry's situation of where he was reportedly found in the hot tub, um, use of ketamine, that was a really bad combination, kind of amplified the effects. And as an addict, I firmly believe anyone who is in substance use disorder, or in an inactive addiction, is trying to numb, trying to escape something that hasn't healed. And I th- I feel like with ketamine, it is still way too early. But how do you tell that to an addict who has tried 12 step groups, who has gone to 4 different rehabs, who has done IOP, PHP, and yes, we are going to talk about all of those different, what are the anagrams? Is that what they are? All the different initials that you'll run into: IOP, OP, PHP, um, who's tried the religious recovery groups. I mean, what do you tell someone like, oh, hey, we have this new thing, but we don't know if it's going to work? There is such a desperation to to not be an addict, that some people go to extreme lengths. Um, I will be curious to follow along with this. Now that it has been thrusted, ketamine that is, has been thrusted into the spotlight to see what the future holds for it. Is it something that is going to continue with treatment? Um, or does the high profile nature of Matthew Perry detour studies and research of it? Do people become off put? So, um, yeah, I believe there is still a lot of research that needs to be done when it comes to it. Um, but it's tragic no matter which way you want to look at as far as when it comes to ketamine with Matthew Perry, it is absolutely tragic. And if you read his book, you'll understand why. So, um, yeah, ketamine, not necessarily a naughty, dirty word yet, but as studies continue to advance, and ways in which it's administered, it'll be curious to see how it falls in line with 12-step groups, with AA, with the Sinclair method, harm reduction method, things like that. So, like I said, very, very short episode here today because I just want to talk about it and talk about Matthew Perry's book, and the things that he's done for recovery. Because while we lost a talented actor, his legacy and the establishments that he's established for recovery, people in recovery to help them out, definitely deserves to be talked about. I know it's sexy and eye grabbing to have the big headlines of like alcoholic drug infused addict Matthew. I get why it's presented that way, but I want to do his memory proper by s- talking about the option that is out there. Um, and hopefully by him being vulnerable with his story helps others to get to that sense of vulnerability. So that is all that I have for this week. Like I said, a little bit different, but this is a great chance to go back and get caught up um, on the episodes that have already laid out. In fact, coming up here in about 2 weeks, so not next week, but the week after, we're going to talk some rehab, intervention rehab. That's the kind of direction we're going to. If you've noticed, we said that last week this is it. Now, what do we do whenever we have someone that isn't willing to go to rehab, or maybe it's time to have that intervention? How do you stage that? Who should be involved? We'll take a deep dive into that, as well as a fantastic TV series that I thoroughly enjoy watching. If you haven't checked it out already, so we'll talk more about that. But yeah, that's it for this week's episode. Appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to this 20-minute program. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Give us a share as well. Shout out to Bobby from Oklahoma, giving us a follow there on X. And make sure you check out Facebook, Instagram, as always trying to post some motivational quotes, motivational posters, sometimes just to help get you into the right frame of mind. So this is Wrestling with Recovery. We are not another wrestling program. No, seriously, we're not. Have a great